Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick Dubois. On this week's show, it's a double by-election defeat for the Tories, capping off a terrible week for the Prime Minister, in which it was also confirmed the UK entered recession in the final quarter of last year. There were two Conservative seats up for grabs, and Labour took them both. In Kingswood, the swing to Labour was 16.4%, overturning a majority of more than 11,000, while in Wellingborough it was a 28.5% swing, overturning a majority of 18,500. That may be the most worrying defeat for the Tories. Their vote share was down 37.6%, with the party also losing support to the right-wing Reform Party. The Tories have seen their majority steadily erode ahead of the next general election, with 10 seats lost to opposition parties. And they have been consistently behind in opinion polls since November 2021.
I am honoured that local people have placed their trust in me and the Labour Party under Keir Starmer. But I also know from the thousands of conversations I have had during this campaign how desperately people want change and a fresh start for our country. The people of Wellingborough have spoken for Britain. This is a stunning victory for the Labour Party and must send a message from Northamptonshire to Downing Street.
There's a feeling that no matter how hard you work, you just can't move forward. And that with Rishi's recession, we're left, again, paying more and getting less.
And joining me now is polling guru and Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University, John Curtice. Sir John, welcome. A pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
Rishi Sunak said after the by-elections that there's no enthusiasm for Labour. Can you see anything in these results, if you like, that point to that back up that crumb of comfort Rishi Sunak's looking for?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that you can read these results to suggest that the level of enthusiasm for Labour is less than the level of discontent with the Conservatives. But bear in mind that on the evidence of these results, particularly the spectacular loss of support in Wellingborough, that the level of discontent with the Conservatives is very high indeed. Another way of looking at what happened is that essentially the rise in the Labour's voting, both in Kingswood and in Wellingborough, was roughly half the fall in the Conservative vote. 38 points nearly in Wellingborough, and 21 points in Kingswood, but with the other half more or less being taken up by the performance of Reform UK. So to that extent, at least, yes, those who are discontented with the Conservatives are certainly not all embracing Labour. Indeed, national opinion polls suggest that now for every one person who switched from Conservative to Labour, there's one who switched from Conservative to Reform. And the way in which the votes split in these two by-elections seems to be consistent with that picture. That said, I think that is pretty limited comfort for the Conservatives, because at the moment, at least, the degree, such enthusiasm as there is for Labour is more than sufficient, it seems, to ensure that Labour will be able to win the next general election with a fairly comfortable majority on all the evidence we've got so far, unless there is a significant turnaround in the government's fortunes between now and what now almost inevitably seems to be bound to be an autumn election.
Interestingly, a few days ago, in the wake of the mini crisis Labour had over their selection of candidate in Rochdale, or deselection of their candidate in Rochdale, a Savanta poll pointed to something like a 7-point drop in their lead. That hasn't really materialised in the by-elections, has it?
Well, actually, you need to realise that most of the polling for that Savanta poll was conducted before the Rochdale by-election problems for Labour. We have actually had a couple of polls published since they were conducted since those events. Both do put Labour down a bit by about a couple of points, though actually the Conservatives are also down a bit as well. It's certainly not markedly changed the position, but maybe at the margin has not done Labour much good. But actually, if you take the polls during February so far, Labour are still doing as well are doing as well as they were doing just before Christmas. So I think, at most marginal. And indeed, one of those two polls found that 45% of people just didn't have a view about how well Sir Keir had handled the situation in Rochdale. We shouldn't exaggerate how important this issue was for many voters. And certainly, given that Labour's performance was what it was in these two by-elections, the increase in their support in Wellingborough was in the top 10. It was arguably a little bit less than Labour might have anticipated in Kingswood, but again, only at the margin. But I think, we're not at the moment saying, oh, Rochdale has fundamentally changed the electoral battle in the way that Boris Johnson and Partygate and Liz Truss and the fiscal event did.
Let me ask you, if I may, about something that does seem to have changed the landscape, is Reform's popularity at this election. 13% in Wellingborough, 10% in Kingswood. That's pretty much in line with polling expectations. Where is that vote coming from? Is it predominantly from the Conservative voters?
Well, it's predominantly coming from people who voted Conservative in 2019. Indeed, for every one person who voted switched from Conservative to Labour, another one is switching from Conservative to Reform. There's a slightly more complicated question, of course, which is what would these people have done if the Reform Party weren't on the ballot? And maybe some of those who switched from Conservative to Reform might have backed Labour, but in truth, what you discover is that virtually everybody who switched from Conservative to Reform are in favour of Brexit. Many of those who switched from the Conservative to Labour have actually changed their minds about Brexit, even if they did vote for Leave back in 2016. So the truth is the two parties, Leave and the Labour Party, are appealing to different kind of discontented Conservative voters. But it's probably true that for the most part, Reform are taking voters that would otherwise be having a good chance of voting for the Conservatives.
So the other significant fact in this election struck me, and you were quick to point this out, is the disengagement of voters. Now, is this just typical by-election where we're always going to get a low turnout, or is it something deeper? Are we seeing any evidence that support for the two main parties is diluted by, frankly, a disengagement and distrust of the main parties?
Well, I mean, by-elections don't always produce high turnout, although it's worth remembering, it just shows you how much the world has changed. There was a by-election in Wellingborough in 1969. Nearly 70% of people turned out to vote. Yesterday, the turnout was just 38% in that constituency. But in this parliament more broadly, across all the by-elections, on average, we're looking at a record decline in turnout of the order of 28%. The last time the figure was almost that high was in the 1997 to 2001 Parliament, in the wake of which turnout in the general election fell to just 59%, a record low. Now, that does mean we've heard, particularly on the Conservative side, claims like, well, look, lots of people stayed at home. They'll be back to the polls in the general election and we'll be able to win them over. Well, they'll be able to win them over is in itself debatable and certainly by no means certain. But I don't think we should assume that all these voters are actually going to turn out in the general election. The evidence of these by-elections so far is that we're heading potentially for another record low turnout in a general election. And that, in a sense, presents a challenge to all of our parties. We've got a discontented, pessimistic electorate, deeply concerned about the public services, some of whom at least also seem to have drawn the conclusion that it isn't also worth going to the polling station. And that does raise questions for all politicians.
So none of the above could be the winner in inverted commas in that. One final question. When we look at by-elections this close to the general election and the pattern we've seen, where should we look for the best indication of what might happen in a general election? Is it still polling, or would you say it's the by-elections?
Oh, well, look, you should look at both, but clearly the question mark is, given how close we are now to the general election. I mean, Rishi Sunak said this was a midterm by-election. No, sorry, the midterm is behind us. We are now towards the fag end of this parliament. But will say to you that the Labour Party won the Wirral South by-election on a very large swing shortly before the 1997 general election, and that proved to be a pretty good indicator of what subsequently happened. Now, we're not quite as close to the likely date of the election as yet, but more broadly, the scale of Conservative losses, both in terms of numbers of by-elections and the extent to which the swing has been against them in this Parliament. The last precedent you can think of is 1992 to 1997. History isn't bound to repeat itself, but it does cast a large shadow over the Conservatives' chances of being able to turn things around.
Sir John Curtice, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
You're welcome.
With that double by-election out of the way, attention now turns to Rochdale, which is also electing a new MP following the death of the Labour incumbent Tony Lloyd. That contest is causing some headaches for Labour. They've withdrawn their support from their candidate Azhar Ali after a recording of comments he made about Israel was leaked to the press. They cannot replace him and will therefore see a safe seat either go to their former candidate, one of the two former Labour MPs now standing for other parties, or the Conservatives. Joining me now to discuss that are journalist and former member of the European Parliament, Annunziata Rees Mogg. We also have the chief political correspondent for The Times, Aubrey Allegretti. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us here today. Annunziata, can I start with you, please? So the Tories are out in full force saying this is midterm blues produce such bad election results, even though we're months away from the next general election. They are out there briefing that actually they're not so bad, particularly in Kingswood. And they would have us believe that an awful lot of Conservative voters stayed at home and will be back in droves for the general election. Isn't the truth? Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, summed it up well when he said, the voters are itching for change. Can the Conservatives do anything to row back what seems to be an appetite for time for a change?
I actually think they can, but possibly not in the way that you are thinking. That the time for a change, there is no appetite for Labour. And actually these election results show that the Labour vote has not grown. There was very low turnout. If you look at Keir Starmer's personal ratings, he's down at -18, which is lower than John Major in '97, just before he lost by a landslide to Tony Blair. That there is not an appetite for Labour. There is, however, a huge disillusionment with the Conservative Party, and that is an extremely hard battle to win in what can't be more than about 9 months, 10 months. The time is running out, but this is an incredibly strong message to the Conservative Party.
How many messages do they have to have?
They need to stop being tone deaf. That by-election after by-election, Conservative supporters have been staying at home. I know Conservative members who have not been going out to support their own party. They don't have the delivery networks left because their supporters aren't doing the hard graft to get them elected.
So let me tell you, in a word, what should they do?
They need to listen to the voters who went to Reform. That the Conservative supporters, the Conservative Party membership, desperately want a party that stands on its core principles. They want smaller government, they want lower taxes, they want to scrap the green agenda, they want to get out of the ECHR and to control immigration. They want to scrap legal immigration at the absurd levels it is. They want their services to work, but they want a conservative party.
So, Aubrey, a move to the right for the Conservatives will actually make them electable. Do you think that stacks up?
It's certainly true that Rishi Sunak is struggling to mobilise, if you like, the base, the Tory activists, who are the sort of grassroots. And that is going to get harder in the next few months, not least because Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has sort of limited fiscal headroom within the rules that he set himself at the spring budget.
To give money away.
Exactly, a sort of pre-election giveaway. So there are lots of things that Conservatives are calling for: cuts to income tax, cuts to corporation tax again, cuts to business rates. Those things are sort of all being called for by various siren voices in the party, the Chancellor has limited room for manoeuvre. The problem will then come in May when we get to the local elections. All the people that we've just been hearing about who the Conservative Party is struggling to get out to sort of pound the pavements, deliver leaflets, canvass for the party, they are at the sort of sharp end of those local elections where the Conservatives, again, were at a high watermark when these elections were being held in May 21. It was prime vaccine rollout, Boris Johnson riding high in the opinion polls. So they're potentially set for a very big loss in May at the local elections as well, which is only going to compound, if you like, that sense that the party is in terminal decline.
But, Annunziata, it's a rather strange predicament we find ourselves in after these by-elections. Reform have taken 13% in Wellingborough, 10% share of the vote in Kingswood. And what Aubrey's outlining is saying, actually, Conservatives, if you do more of that, you have a route back to power. And yet the leader of Reform, Richard Tice, his mission is simply to smash the Tories. What sort of party policy objective is that? And is that really going to actually help the Conservative cause?
I think there are very strong parallels to draw here with the European elections in 2019. I actually had my count in 2019 when I topped the poll as an MEP for the East Midlands in the same building as the count that we've just seen in Kettering for the by-election. The Brexit Party topped that poll by a long way across the country. In the East Midlands, we went from a slate of Conservative MEPs to a slate of Brexit Party ones. There was a whole-scale change. Now, what do we learn from that? Well, we had Theresa May as the leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister at that time, and she was trying to do everything she could to derail Brexit. The Conservative Party listened to that election result. They got rid of Theresa May, they changed their leader, they changed their policies, they promised to get Brexit done. And a mere 7 months later, what do you see? A massive landslide for the Conservatives. Things can change, but they need to listen to the voters.
But just follow your theory, and briefly, if you could, on this one. That argues Richard Tice, leader of Reform, should be saying, change, Conservatives, work with me, have a partnership with me, not to smash them.
Come on, Nick, you know as well as I do that politics is absolutely stuffed with egos. That Richard Tice has done extraordinary things to change the political landscape in this country, just as Nigel Farage did before him. But he has a personal stake in this. He has been funding Reform himself. He has been struggling to raise money. I don't know how they think they are going to fight every seat across the country at the next general election. It seems like a fantasy. However, they are making a difference, but they don't need to make a difference to the outcome of the next general election if the Conservative Party take on board what it is their supporters are asking for.
If I may, I think that Richard Tice and Reform are playing a slightly longer game here. I actually don't think they have very much interest in winning seats at the next election, at least on a sort of scale which presents them as being a particularly big threat in the next Parliament. I suspect that their bigger challenge really is to get as close as possible to the Conservative votes and then start sort of eating away at them in the next Parliament to try and replace them completely. I don't think their aim is to really sort of take a few seats here and there at the next election.
So you think they're like Reform in Canada trying to replace the Conservative Party? I think they're a very long way off that. That it might be different if Nigel was still with them, that he has a very, very genuine, large
Well, how do we know he isn't,
support.
Annunziata? Do you know something we don't know?
No, but he currently isn't, and that could change. I mean, there is a lot that could change between now and January 25, the very, very last day that we can have a general election.
Is Nigel Farage, would that be the icing on the cake for Reform, or would it actually be quite divisive for Reform? Because Richard Tice was in this studio sort of very reluctant to commit to Nigel Farage as coming forward, but interestingly, what he said was his mission was to smash the Tories. That's not Nigel Farage's. He's been having dinner and going to dancing with them and everything. He seems to think they should just change.
Nigel Farage is, I think, sort of trying to show a little bit of ankle to everyone, to keep them sort of guessing. He is a bit like Boris Johnson in that he likes to be seen as the kind of knight over the water type figure who is constantly talked about and constantly being guessed about what they might do next. He did feature on the Wellingborough by-election leaflets for the Reform Party, so he is still quite closely tied to them, even as an honorary president of the party as well. And so I suspect he's basically waiting closer to the general election to decide whether or not to throw his lot in with Reform full stop, or whether or not it's best taking a back seat, focusing on the US election in November instead, and then potentially positioning himself to come in at a potential future Conservative leadership election somehow and present himself as the only way the Conservative Party could possibly rebuild itself after a potentially eviscerating defeat.
It's been an interesting last few days in the politics in the United Kingdom. The week before started off with Keir Starmer in trouble over his Rochdale candidate. He'd rode back on his green prosperity plans. And then, of course, the UK went into what the Conservatives describe as a technical recession, but is in fact just a recession, as we can see. That was announced on election day in the by-elections that have just taken place. Do you think that featured at all? Did that actually help Labour or do more harm to the Conservatives? Or was it just ignored?
I mean, often postal votes are really what sort of swing these types of things. So people will probably have submitted their postal ballots in the days and weeks before this news. It takes often at least a day, 2 days, 3 days for sort of big national news to often filter down and reach the sorts of people that don't obsessively follow politics, like I'm sure all of us do. So I'm sure that it will have been felt, but probably won't have made a massive difference to people's votes. Ultimately, these are chances for people to send a message, and a by-election is only really going to be attended by people that already feel strongly one way or another.
Also, the British people aren't stupid. That absolutely everyone in this country knows that the pound in their pocket is not getting them the lifestyle or the goods and services that it previously did. They know, we all know, we feel poorer. They didn't need the statistics to come out to tell them that technically we're in recession. The GDP per cap actually fell 0.7% last year. That's what people already knew. That's what they're feeling. They're feeling inflation, they're feeling their wealth falling. And Rishi has got to tackle that. But I noted you said before that he's lost the wiggle room. Jeremy Hunt has lost the wiggle room.
For the upcoming budget.
For the upcoming budget. And I completely disagree with that. That if you want to get the country growing, you have got to cut taxes to encourage enterprise, to encourage consumption.
But is that more Liz Truss, or because she didn't show how she'd fund it, went into chaos, government collapsed, and that's a legacy they're living
cuts as well.
And spending cuts, yes. Absolutely. But what the voters are calling for is actually a smaller government, a less invasive into personal lives government, and lower taxes to keep their own pounds in their pockets.
Are they? And let me just put an alternative view to you. At the moment, the top demand is, in terms of polling, is the state of the economy. The second is the NHS. And actually, the NHS being up there, that's not going to benefit from cuts, is it?
If you talk to either Reform Party or Conservative voters, actually the number one issue is immigration. And the reason that our GDP per person, per household, per cap has gone down is that we have had such a swelling population. GDP has not been growing at the same pace as the number of people in this country. And that is why people are feeling it much more acutely than the nationalised figures show. Now, there's a lot that Rishi could do still to tackle that. He could take us out of the ECHR. That would go down extremely well with the voters who might vote for him anyway.
The Tories are divided on that. Aubrey, the Tories are divided on coming out of the ECHR. He may satisfy the right, the Reform voters, but he'd lose the One Nation Tories.
Exactly. He's being pulled in sort of opposite directions by both wings of his party, and the Conservatives haven't managed to find a strategy for reigniting the 2019
It's the One Nation
coalition.
Tories that are leaving in droves for the Labour Party. And if he wants to have any...
You mean the voters?
The voters, yeah. The voters who support the left of the Conservative Party are moving to Labour.
But doesn't that say again...
What he's got to do is consolidate his actual base, who will come out and vote for him.
But you don't win an election with a base, do you?
There are enough of them for him to win, particularly if he wins back the voters who are so disenchanted they've gone to the Reform.
OK, but perhaps taking that logic, if immigration is the number one issue amongst Conservative-minded and Reform-minded voters, the number 3 in the country, that didn't show in these by-elections, did it? Because they didn't come out sort of absolutely in their droves for Reform or Conservatives. Labour won.
Absolutely. I mean, Labour did a good job at mobilising their campaigners, and they can legitimately claim that they have inflicted the biggest Conservative to Labour swing, second only, I think, since the Second World War. So they can claim that there has been, a big victory here, which was not just driven by sort of local circumstances.
You've also got to appreciate that 13% of people voted for a party that didn't exist at the last time they got asked.
That's a fair point. Now, for time reasons only, and I'm only going to ask you this question fair. You're a former Brexit MEP. You were, for the last 7 weeks, have been an MEP. You were the Conservative MEP. Will you be voting Conservative at this general election?
Most likely. There are very unlikely scenarios in which I can see I wouldn't. As it happens that even in this current environment, I think I live in a safe Conservative seat, but it's also an extremely Brexit seat, the most Brexit-supporting area of the country, Boston and Skegness, and I will have to wait and see what happens. But overall, I think we desperately need to have anything but a Labour landslide.
Annunziata, Rees Mogg and Aubrey Allegretti from The Times, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on TRT World. Don't forget, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. Just type in Westminster Watch. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.